Welcome to Authors Night with East Hampton Library. This event is generously sponsored by CIBC Private Wealth Management and the Hilaria and Alec Baldwin Foundation, Patty Kenner, Barbara and Stephen Hyman, Michelle Tortorelli and Tom Kearns, and Janet C. Ross. We are pleased to present Allison Pataki and Owen Pataki being interviewed by Governor George Pataki. So at the end of the interview, there will be a Q&A portion. So please type your questions into the chat and I will get to them with about 15 minutes left and I will ask our great authors and interviewer. But thank you guys for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you all for being on. And let me thank the East Hampton Library. We have always loved this event, and I particularly love making Alec Baldwin shuck oysters for me, but sadly we're doing it by Zoom, but hopefully next year we'll be there in person. Sometimes I feel like the father of the Bronte family because I have children who are such great authors, and I appreciate your having them on to explain their most recent works to the followers of the East Hampton Library. And let me just hold up the two most recent. Allison's The Queen's Fortune, which is about Desiree, Napoleon's first fiancée who ended up becoming Queen of Sweden, and Owen's Searchers in Winter, which he wrote as a sequel to his earlier book that he did with Allison, Where the Light Falls. So let me start. These books both take place largely in France in the Napoleonic era. Now, Allison, I know you and Owen have been interested in this part of history for some time. Why France? Why that particular era?
Yeah. There's no shortage of reasons, and not bottom of the list was having to go to Paris to do a research trip, right? No. That was an added bonus, but yeah, the French Revolution in particular has been of particular interest, I think, to both Owen and I and our whole family for a personal reason, because we do have French ancestors and we do have French family. Owen and I share a French grandmother. Our mother's mom was 100% French, Monique Leblanc. She was born and raised in France and the French Protectorate of Morocco. And we still have family living there in Paris and around Paris and elsewhere in France. So it has always held a particular interest to us personally. But I think on a larger scale, there are fascinating aspects to French history. In particular, holds a particular interest because it was an incredibly tumultuous time. It was a time of incredible upheaval. It was a period that has some corollaries to us as Americans, with the American Revolution being our revolution for independence just a few years, a decade prior. Of course, the French were the Americans' first allies during our American Revolution. And then you see the French Revolution as this sort of dark mirror image to the American Revolution, where our founding fathers and our framers of the Constitution went in one direction, and you see the French Revolution take a very dark turn. And you see, as a result, human nature in this very, very mirrored, dark, this dark perspective. That's sort of the antithesis. And so Napoleon, as this figure, obviously we all learn about in school. Everybody knows the large brushstrokes of the French Revolution and Napoleon's rise to power. But when I discovered this figure of Desiree and on to become this huge critical figure of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era and the time period after that,
we can see you're having some technical difficulties. You're coming in broken up a little bit, but we'll try to keep it going.
Ellen, your book, Searchers in Winter,
yes,
is essentially a sequel to your earlier book, Where the Light Falls, that you did with Allison. And Where the Light Falls is set in the height of the French Revolution. And it goes through the horrors of the revolution, the guillotine and all the other horrors, and comes out the other end. Now you pick up after the revolution. Why that interest in the Napoleonic period? Same question I asked Allison. And when you finished the first book, did you have a concept that you'd be writing a sequel after that?
Yeah, well, kind of to piggyback off of what Ali just said, all of those things about the French Revolution being a mirror of, or kind of a dark mirror of the American Revolution, the Napoleonic era from his younger days with Desiree, his incredibly successful and energetic rise to power until he eventually becomes the emperor and goes on to fight these epic Napoleonic, war sequences of wars, was of course a very interesting period of history, and so that was kind of ripe for the picking. But Ali and I, when we were writing Where the Light Falls, we really did. A lot of people ask us, did I write the battle scenes and Ali wrote the romance scenes, or this, that, and really that wasn't the case. We both really, I had the original idea. I kind of pitched to Ali, and Ali took it and ran with it and said this would be a great idea for a book. She had written 3 New York Times bestsellers, so it kind of made sense that she sees it in a literary way. I saw it originally as a kind of a cinematic series or a movie way. But as we were going through it and we were co-writing it, we really did both have a hand in every page of the book. We both took turns writing dialogue, writing the prose. So we really were working through the story, the characters, the plot, changing things around the timeline together. And as you said, Ali, the French Revolution, there's so much there, and we both kind of just dove in. And I think that's where your interest in Desiree came from. And doing that research and learning and diving into that time period was where that kind of caught my interest into the Napoleonic era, and figuring this would be a very, very appropriate setting to kind of pick up this kind of epic story that we've started and we kind of were working our way through. But as we were wrapping it up, Ali and I both kind of, without planning it, we both agreed that it seemed right for a follow-on, for a continuation. Some of these characters who've been through a lot, they've been through the Reign of Terror, the guillotine, the darkest days of the French Revolution and Napoleon's rise, but there's so much more to follow. And we both kind of kept it open-ended, just kind of naturally. We didn't really plan a sequel, but we did think that maybe these characters had a little more life to them. And so that opened the door in the epilogue of the story, without giving anything away, to the possibility of more happening. And then the idea came maybe a year or two later. I was at film school and I started to pick up a plot and a direction these characters could go in. And I kind of, I took it over and wrote the second one myself, but Ali was very helpful in pitching ideas, bouncing ideas of the character. So we did do a lot of kind of brainstorming together, but that seemed like a good time for me to pick up and try to write my own book. But Ali and I both kind of, I don't want to say from the beginning, but from deep into the first book, we had an idea that the characters might continue on after the book ended.
And I think when you look at modern European history, it would be harder to pinpoint a moment in time that is more dramatic and tumultuous than the French Revolution. And you just have, every human vice and virtue with these epic figures who come to life. And obviously Napoleon kind of looms the largest over the end of the revolution. When he came to power and really solidified his grip, he said, the revolution is over. I am now the revolution. And he sort of became, the life force of France at that point. And then of course took them on to another 10 plus years of war. Where did it end? It ended with them reinstating a Bourbon king, which is exactly how they started. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. But because of how tumultuous and chaotic this period was, you have these figures who emerge who make for really compelling reading, as Owen and I would probably both agree. And that's the case when you're reading just the dry historical facts, but also for Owen and I both choosing fiction. I think why we love historical fiction is because history, when you delve into periods like the French Revolution and like these periods of chaos and huge personalities, it provides all the raw material for, great page-turning stories. Hopefully, is what we would, intend to be the case. And so with the story of Desiree and with Owen and I working on Where the Light Falls, and I'm sure with Searchers in Winter, you don't need to deviate that far from the history to have a blueprint for a really juicy, dramatic story. And that's certainly how I felt with writing Desiree's. Just kept coming across these figures and these characters and these settings where I was thinking, this is too good to be true. And yet it was true and it was historical. So that's a huge part of why I love historically based books in particular.
So Allison, this
Yeah.
book, The Queen's Fortune, is about Desiree. You should explain a little bit about her, but before that, two of your bestsellers were about the last Empress of Austria-Hungary, Sisi, the accidental Empress and the Empress on their own. And this one is about a woman who became Queen of Sweden, Desiree. You might want to explain a little about what happened there, but what is this about queens and Allison Pataki that is so intriguing?
Yeah. Well, neither Desiree nor Sisi ever intended to become queens or empresses, and never actually imagined that that would be their trajectory. Empress Sisi was sort of a Princess Diana figure, a beloved figure of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who was plucked from obscurity when the Emperor of Austria fell in love with her when he was supposed to be marrying her elder sister. So she's, taken from the age of 15 and put on the throne of Austria-Hungary, at that time just the Austrian Empire, and becomes empress of much of Europe. And she was a fascinating, beloved figure to this day, who's huge in Europe, and yet again, Americans are not as familiar with her. And then Desiree also was just this young, guileless female, young lady living in France during the darkest days of the French Revolution, who falls in love with this ambitious upstart artilleryman named Napoleon Bonaparte, who's at that point basically a Corsican refugee. And their lives become entangled through his rise during the French Revolution. He goes on to become emperor, breaks her heart, but she marries his top general, Bernadotte, in the process. And they go on to have this fascinating life story that leads them to the throne of Sweden. And so in both cases, with Desiree and Sisi, it was an instance of knowing this time period in history, having studied it, knowing many of the men who were involved, having a familiarity with the facts and the dates and the large broad strokes, but not knowing enough about these women who were there, who were not only front and center, witnessing history from the front row, but actively shaping it and having a hand in it, and just thinking it's time to put them center stage and give them time as the leading ladies of their own story. And so pulling these women from history, yes, they were queens, yes, they had power, but relative to the men who were there, their stories have not been told as largely and as broadly. And so giving them this moment with these historically inspired stories of really telling their life stories. And some people, of course, are familiar with the names of Desiree and Sisi, but really putting them center stage. And Desiree's legacy, to this day is ongoing. Her family still sits on the thrones of Sweden, whereas Napoleon's descendants are no longer in power. So I do love the poetic justice of that Desiree did get the last laugh, and that her power continues to this day, even after Napoleon broke her heart and tried to kind of push her to the side.
So, Allie, I have a follow-up question. This wasn't in the notes, but I was just curious thinking about it as you were answering that question. So when you were doing research for Desiree, I know you'd seen I think it was the Marlon Brando Napoleon movie where she was in it. But so we both know Napoleon Bonaparte, and he's considered one of the most written about historical figures in Western history and any history throughout time. So he's pretty easy to kind of research, or at least, to find material written by him, written by his compatriots, written by historians. And so the French Revolution as well, a ton of ink has been spilled. But I was wondering about Desiree. We've never really discussed this. What were your best ways to do research on her? Because I would imagine there's not as much information about her. I mean, Joseph and Napoleon Bonaparte, yes, but how did you find doing research for someone who's kind of starts out in the shadow of these giant figures?
No, you hit it right on the head. She was totally in the shadow. There is an Anne-Marie Salenko book, which I referenced at the beginning of the talk, that was written in the 50s, originally in German, which was a huge bestseller across Europe and has been published in English. It's fiction. And then it was adapted into the Marlon Brando film that you referenced. I've actually not read the Anne-Marie Salenko book or seen the film, just because they are fictional renderings of the character, and I did not want to be influenced by somebody else's fictional rendering. I wanted to stick to a diet of straight up fact and nonfiction. But actually, I got the tip off to discover the character of Desiree from our father, who's sitting right there, who late night was watching the film, came across this character of Desiree. And I think how you explained it, Dad, was you said, this is totally made up. You know, Marlon Brando didn't have this first fiance who went on to be involved in his administration, who then was there when he was defeated in 1812, whose husband went on to fight against him, and who went on to become Queen of Sweden, right? And you just did some Googling and you discovered Desiree Clary was in fact this historical figure. And so Dad, knowing at that point that I had written several novels about women in history who I liked to pull from the shadows and put center stage, said, you know, you really ought to look into this character of Desiree Clary. And I did, and I came to the same conclusion, which is this is fascinating. And how do we not, why do we learn about Napoleon and Louis the 16th and even, you know, Marie Antoinette and Josephine, but we don't learn about Desiree in history? And so, Owen, as you said, I began doing the research, and what I very quickly found was that there were no, other than the Anne-Marie Selinko book, which was fictional, that I did not want to read just because it was fictional. There were no English language biographies where Desiree was the main character. And as you said, there are copious biographies about Napoleon Bonaparte and Josephine and Bernadotte, Desiree's husband. And so that was actually a blessing and a curse. That made it kind of fun because Desiree features very prominently as a supporting character in the Napoleon biographies, in the Josephine biography, in the Bernadotte biography, of course. But she's always the supporting character that comes in and out of the scenes. And so what I had to do was I had to study all of the big players around her and zoom in microscopically on the scenes where she entered and the moments where she was prominent, and sort of then stitch together this tapestry of her life. And that, so it was a blessing and a curse. It was a curse in that I didn't have just sort of source material here. Here's her life story. Here's the timeline. Here's how it went. But it was a blessing in that I'm writing historical fiction. So her character began to emerge for me because of the way she appeared in and out of all these other biographies. But then I was able to have this moment where I could piece it all together and make her the central figure. And that was really, really fun. So for instance, I know, you know, from the Napoleon biography, coach with them at the assassination attempt on this date, you know, with these people. But then I get to tell the story from her perspective. And with her as the central leading lady. And so I thought that was really, really fun. Keeping in mind also, she's living hundreds of years ago. And so again, that allowed me sort of, I had the source material I needed to know the broad strokes, the dates, the figures who were there, the locations. But then I'm able to flesh, this is how I'll put it. I had the bones, but then I had the freedom to really go in and put on the flesh and the meat and make her story come to life and give that, you know, color. And so that was really, really fun.
Interesting.
So, Owen, while we're on the subject of Napoleon, the opening paragraph of your book, I just love, and I have to read that now. General Bonaparte is dead. He is gone, making way for the Emperor Napoleon. The same citizens who cheered with glee at the beheading of their sovereign and shouted death to kings, a mere 11 years later, now joyfully cried, Vive l'Empereur. I think that encapsulates the dramatic change and yet not change that occurred in those 11 years. And as you and Allie have both said, the dominant figure in this entire area is Napoleon. And yet, in your book, he's not a dominant presence. He is looming in the background continually. He's always somewhere in the background, but he's almost a non-character. And others play critical roles. Could you explain what you were thinking and what some of those other characters are, as opposed to Napoleon dominating your novel?
Yeah, so I guess the first part of that question about Napoleon and Napoleon not being the primary focus is because fundamentally you, unlike Desiree, which is a story about a historical figure, and that's historical fiction, but you're writing about a person who's true to history. Our first book, Where the Light Falls, figures around 3 or 4 main characters who are all fictional, who are all not at that kind of royal status, but they're of varying kind of social backgrounds and classes. And it largely continues, again, I don't want to give anything away, but the format continues into the second book, where there's a kind of ensemble cast of fictional characters who are military soldiers in the Grande Armée, they're law people, there's regular civilians, there's characters in what's now Poland, in the Duchy, what would become the Duchy of Warsaw a year after the book takes place. So that, you know, there's characters from Spain, there's characters at home on the home front in Normandy. So I really wanted to keep the story about the characters and about the story we had begun to tell and keep that going. And I've found in movies and in books that I like, and again, I'll just give a kind of the first example that pops into my head. Bernard Cornwell is a very well-known English author who's done whose books got made into that, you know, hit Netflix series The Last Kingdom, but he also did a series of Napoleonic era stories about a British soldier who rises from a private all the way to a colonel. And throughout those stories, in all of his books, and a lot of writers who are kind of like that, whether it's you know, the Master and Commander novel series or the Richard Sharp series, I like it when you have a compelling fictional character or an ensemble of fictional characters that are coming into contact with these big, larger than life individuals like a Napoleon or like a Wellington in the Richard Sharp Cornwell series, or Alfred the Great in the Last Kingdom book and television series. I think it's interesting where you get that. Vikings is another show where you have a lot of real, true historical characters that might be kind of shrouded in the historical haze, if you will, especially going back that far to medieval Europe. But Napoleon, you know, the Napoleonic Wars is a little more light shed on it. But either way, I found it interesting to see these characters in these tumultuous epic times, like Ali mentioned, like the French Revolution or like the Napoleonic Wars, but not focus too much on a historical figure that people come into studying them and they already have a preconceived idea, or they've read a book about Napoleon. They don't need to see a series about Napoleon unless that's what they're looking for. So I wanted to keep it about the characters and to keep it about to keep it fictional, but it is kind of fun to play with Napoleon, to play with these Bernadotte or Desiree, these characters, and that is definitely an enjoyable part of it. But to your second point, there are several other characters that kind of make cameos or who appear in our stories, and the first one as well as Searchers in Winter, and I think a big one that you might be alluding to here is Joseph Fouché, Napoleon's police minister, who is the minister of police and basically the Machiavellian intelligence minister who helped orchestrate Napoleon's rise when he was, you know, about to stage his famous coup where he becomes first consul and later emperor. But Fouché is one of these really kind of lost to history characters that you don't really read about, you don't hear too much about unless you're really kind of reading a biography about Napoleon or studying this time period in particular. But he was a really, really fascinating character there's a quote, and I forget who it's attributed to, but they said he was the only man alive that Napoleon feared. And the reason being, he could out Napoleon, not in terms of military strategy or military genius or his charisma or his capacity to inspire his soldiers and his people and his politicians to follow him, but because he knew Napoleon and his, let's say, Machiavellian tactics and his need for information, for intelligence, his willingness to use very underhanded tactics to, you know, instigate rebellion, to install his brothers and his sisters on the thrones of Europe. And Fouché was privy to all the inner workings that Napoleon had going on behind the scenes, and there was a lot of that, obviously. So he features in this book, and I just found him very interesting because he outlasted all of the major players from starting before the French Revolution. He was studying to become a priest in seminary school, and he was actually on his way to becoming a member of the clergy. The French Revolution happens. He becomes a radical Jacobin, basically what we would consider a Marxist, who was one of the leaders of the Reign of Terror, who was responsible for some of the most violent and horrifically oppressive counter-revolutionary actions in cities like Lyon and in Paris, and who actually almost got beheaded for being too aggressive by Robespierre. Robespierre thought he was being a little too bloodthirsty, which means he went pretty far. he spread a rumor about Robespierre, who was one of the masterminds of the French Reign of Terror, and orchestrated his downfall. Helps Napoleon come to power. Napoleon gets rid of him because he sees him as too cunning and too sly a man to trust. So he gets rid of him, recalls him back. Napoleon gets deposed, comes back, gets deposed again. Fouché comes back and serves the king, Louis XVIII. So Napoleon is outlasted by, as is Robespierre, as is Danton, as are these monumental figures. They don't last as long as Fouché. And Fouché, which is incredible because he was as kind of cutthroat and bloodthirsty as Napoleon could be in his wrong moments. So he's a character that I really did a lot of research on, who I didn't plan to have play such a role in the book. But the more you study, Ali, you know, the story kind of unravels for you as you're doing the research. And Fouché is one of those interesting characters that I'd recommend people just take a glance at, because he's a fascinating character.
Yeah, every good novel needs a really good bad guy. And Fouché qualifies as a really good bad guy, actually in history, but more so in your novel. Allison, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I
want to jump in on this. I want to jump in on this theme of outlasting, because the log line of the Queen's fortune is, you know, it's the Queen's fortune and the dynasty that outlasted the emperor. Because Owen, like you, that was another thing that I just found so intriguing. Desiree outlasted Napoleon and Josephine and the Bourbons and the Jacobins and all of them. And that was something I truly loved. But also I have to just say, Owen, I loved the way you wrote Napoleon in your book with just his small cameo, because, you know, Napoleon is one of these figures that is just mythical in terms of how large his legacy is. And even in his own life, he loomed larger than any mortal human should. And he was aware of that. You have these people in history, like, you know, more recently, a John F. Kennedy or even a Jackie Kennedy, where these people just, they develop this, their legacy runs away from them and becomes larger than their own lives indeed were. And Napoleon, I felt like that too when I was writing the book. The way you write him, he would come out with these things where it was just like too good to be true, but then they were actual quotes of things he said, because he was, you know, just so crazy and megalomaniacal. But I felt sort of a similar thing that you've mentioned in the past, where you have this figure like Desiree, who's the star of the book, and then as soon as Napoleon comes in, or Josephine was the same way, they steal the scene and the scene runs away with them. And so as a writer, it's a challenge, but it was also really fun to be able to explore them and to be able to have the artistic license that fiction affords you to make them characters in your story. And I thought it was fun. And I also just thought that it was then ultimately very gratifying for me that Desiree outlasts Napoleon and goes on to found this empire where Napoleon's topples and hers continues to this day. She was a little different from Fouché in terms of her tactics and her strategy. But it was sort of a nice historical justice.
Yeah, she's not one of the bad guys, that's for sure. But she had to navigate an incredibly difficult balancing act. And one of the things that intrigued me about your book is she married one of Napoleon's marshals.
Yes.
Napoleon and Bernadette hated each other. Yes. Bernadette eventually became king of Sweden because he couldn't stand Napoleon. He was married to Desiree. She moves to Sweden. Bernadette mounts the Swedish army to fight against Napoleon. Desiree is not happy in Sweden and moves back to Paris, where her sister is married to Napoleon's brother. How does she manage when her husband and Napoleon can't stand each other and are fighting against each other, to be living in Paris as the Queen of Sweden with her sister married to Napoleon's brother? I found that fascinating.
It's a good question.
Yep, and of course the French are trying to recruit her to spy for them. The Swedes are trying to get her to spy on the French, because she has this relationship where she's part of the Bonaparte inner circle, but she's also the Queen of Sweden while Sweden is at war with France. So incredibly fascinating and an incredibly tenuous position. And so Bernadette actually and Bonaparte started out as the closest of friends and commanders in arms together. And while Napoleon was fighting in Egypt, and Fouché and all these incredibly cutthroat French politicians are conniving back in Paris, they actually wanted to offer Bernadette the throne before they offered it to Bonaparte. And Bernadotte turned it down. The rumor in history was that he had "Death to Kings" tattooed across his chest. He truly believed in the French Revolution and in the Constitution and in France staying as a republic. Of course, Napoleon was all too willing to become their general and to eventually become a consul, who would then go on to become the emperor. But it was when Napoleon rose to power and took on this role, this outsized role in the government, that he and Bernadotte really started to fracture as friends. And so the thought was that Napoleon wanted to neutralize Bernadotte because he knew he was a great general. He knew he was beloved by the people. He knew that he had a totally different idea for how the French Republic and Revolution should go. And so he offers Bernadotte this throne in Sweden, probably in large part in an attempt to just get Bernadotte far away and to no longer have this rival in the French government. Desiree was not thrilled by that. She was not thrilled to go on and become Sweden's queen. She found out how cold it was. She found out how far it was from France. And she told her husband, "I'll be spending a lot of my time back home in France. Thank you very much." But ultimately, as things did fracture and as Sweden did go to war with France, Desiree did have to choose sides. And ultimately, I think in her heart, her loyalty stayed always. She always saw herself as a French woman. The Swedes said she was a French woman to the very tips of her fingers up until the day she died. But she, unlike a lot of her contemporaries and the figures with whom she was surrounding herself, she did, stay married. She did go to Sweden. She did take on, this role as Queen of Sweden. But what was particularly interesting to me was that ultimately, in the end, she's pushed aside by Napoleon. She's sort of married off to his general, Bernadotte. She's sent packing to Sweden. Josephine is chosen over her as Napoleon's love and Empress of France. But as Napoleon fell, ultimately the relationship between Desiree and Josephine becomes very, very interesting. And I'm not going to give anything away because then you won't have to read the book. But these two women who featured so prominently in Napoleon's life, Josephine and Desiree, their relationship evolves and takes on sort of a life of its own in history that plays out in very fascinating ways. And they sort of had, their own comeuppance against Napoleon, who breaks both of their hearts in the end. Napoleon, when he was in exile at the end of his life, wrote extensively and was very fascinated with how his legacy would be viewed and how he would be remembered. And you can just tell from the furious writing that he did about Bernadotte and Desiree that it really bothered him that he saw he was the star. He had made their fortune. He had given Bernadotte his throne. He had given Desiree her life and her power and her prominent position, and that they were still sitting on thrones in Sweden when he had been toppled by them, he saw sort of. And so you can see by some of the folklore of the things he said on his deathbed or the things that he wrote in his last years, that this was a very fascinating, complicated, contentious relationship and love triangle between Bernadotte and Napoleon and Desiree until the end of their lives. And Desiree kept Napoleon's love letters until the end of her life. And so this square sort of, it's more than a triangle between Desiree, Josephine, Napoleon, and Bernadotte. It was complicated and complex and fascinating until the very end.
Well, it is. It's just an amazing story. And the fact that it's basically true is what truly was shocking to me.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, I'm learning a lot about kind of Desiree and Bernadotte here from a subject matter expert. But I'm sure you know that one of the big moments of their falling out, Napoleon and Bernadotte, it was like you said, it had early seeds, but one of the big ones was Bernadotte just failing to kind of show up at one of the major battles in Napoleon's career, the Battle of Jena, Auerstadt, where Bernadotte and a bunch of Napoleon's corps are scattered and Bernadotte is off on the wings. And Napoleon says, if you hear gunfire, come help out your fellow marshals and me because we're engaged. Bernadotte doesn't show up. He doesn't come to the battle. And to this day, Napoleon, well, not to this day, but for the rest of his career, Napoleon, as you said, would hold that grudge and would never forgive him for that moment. And Bernadotte never really regains his status alongside Napoleon. Do you think Bernadotte, and again, it's impossible to know for sure, but do you think Bernadotte had any sort of intentional or even kind of like incidental willingness, kind of desire to kind of stick it to Napoleon? Like, was there anything like that, or was it just a complete coincidence and unfortunate event for him?
Yeah, and Napoleon at the end of it called him a bungler and told him he should have him shot or court-martialed.
Right.
And I think Bernadotte
Yeah.
likewise never forgave Napoleon for that. And if you back up a few years prior, it was Bernadotte who saved Napoleon's life in Italy. Bernadotte crossed the mountains, you know, Hannibal style with his troops to bail out Napoleon when he was stranded in snowstorms. And then Bernadotte also thought that Napoleon completely bungled Egypt as well, and then was disgusted with him for breaking quarantine to rush back to France to exploit the political situation when he himself had turned down the offer to seize power in a coup with Fouché. And so they had these series of, I would say that the tension was building for years. I think when you get to Jena or Iéna, it was truly a miscommunication. It was sort of a case of missed signals where Bernadotte was where he thought he was supposed to be, and Napoleon thought that Bernadotte was not in the right place. And then, of course, you know, Napoleon makes Bernadotte a marshal of the empire and gives him the throne of Sweden and gives him the princeship of Pontecorvo. So obviously they went on and mended things after that and did serve together for France for years after that. But I think that was one of the breaking points. And I don't think it was intentional. I don't think, as you said, Bernadotte was trying to stick it to him. But where I do think another huge source of discontent and tension in the relationship was ultimately with Desiree, because Napoleon, as he saw it, he puts Desiree to the side. He thinks Josephine is a more alluring and appealing figure. She probably brings, at the time of their marriage, more social cachet within Paris high society. She's of the nobility, so she links him to sort of the power class that he's always aspired to be a part of in a way that Desiree doesn't. And then what happens, as history, the rumors have it, Napoleon says, Bernadotte, you know, why don't you take Desiree? She, you know, his ex-girlfriend to Bernadotte. Bernadotte and Desiree go on to have this love match, this marriage. They have a son immediately. They have an heir. They establish this dynasty. Napoleon and Josephine then are, you know, marry in this whirlwind relationship that's the stuff of legend. What happens? They never conceive. Napoleon becomes obsessed with the fact that he does not have a son, that Josephine cannot give him a son. And he, you know, is then ultimately writing until the day he dies that he gave Bernadotte everything, including his wife and his family and his throne. And I think it was a big source of discontent between them. And then Napoleon goes on and divorces Josephine so that he can then marry a Habsburg princess to have his son. So I think in many ways, Bernadotte had a lot of the things that Napoleon personally did not have, including, you know, the marriage, the son, maybe perhaps the integrity that Napoleon saw that he himself had not had. And so I don't think that was an intentional moment of sticking it to him, but I think it was one of the many points along the timeline where they erupted in this tension, and where ultimately you see that their cannot continue, that they go their separate ways, and that the parting of that friendship has historical ramifications. And also one thing I will add is late in life, Napoleon writes, Bernadotte was the snake that we nurtured in our bosom. I think he took Bernadotte's willingness to fight with the coalition forces, you know, in the Battle of the Nations, and in ultimately these head-to-head matchups that would bring about Napoleon's toppling. I think he took that so personally and saw it as such a betrayal on the part of Bernadotte, because I think he always thought, even if I allow Emperor Bernadotte to go on and become King of Sweden, and he said as much to Bernadotte, Bernadotte's first loyalty should always be to me. It should always be to France. And Bernadotte said, I can't do that. If I go to become King of Sweden, I have to make that, you know, my loyalty. I have to make my allegiance. And so Napoleon wanted Bernadotte, actually, as he was leaving, to write an oath that he would never go to war against France as the King of Sweden. And Bernadotte refused. And so what did he say? He said, go then and let our let our fates be decided. I think they both knew that ultimately there was a distinct possibility that they would clash, just because they had been clashing for so many years as individuals.
Well, yeah, Napoleon said a lot of interesting things when he was exiled on Mount St. Helena at the end. So
Yeah.
I would definitely say take everything he writes in his kind of post-emperor exile with a huge grain of salt, because if you look at his marshals, the amount of marshals and generals who either died, were executed, or betrayed him is almost half of them, you know? So he definitely, if he's calling Bernadotte a snake, he nurtured a lot of snakes in his bosom, because Bernadotte wasn't the only one that either was killed, executed, or Marat betrayed him, Marshal Ney was firing squatted. So yeah, I think that's probably a little harsh on Bernadotte.
Yeah, and even his family members, his sisters, who he would make queens of all these countries, and then and his own mother, you know, he was always feuding.
Yeah.
Obviously, he was a very explosive personality.
Vengeful, and I think he had his own part to play in his own downfall. That's for sure. It wasn't just Bernadotte and Desiree. That's for sure. But
getting
well,
back
that's why I love the poetic justice of how things end.
Right.
Well, speaking of how things end, I don't know if they have ended, but for either one of you in this genre, but I do want to ask Owen one more question about Searchers of Winter. You know, it's epic in its geographic scale. A number of events take place in Paris. There's major scenes set in Normandy on the Count's estate. There is the entire sweeping battle epic through the various German states, through Silesia, through the Duchies of Warsaw, through Prussia. And out of this, 4 real main positive characters emerge. The lawyer in Paris, the Countess who's defending her family's homestead in Normandy, the Count who's off as an officer in Napoleon's army, and one of his officers who works with him. How did you manage to deal with the geographic scope? At the same time, you have the Rothschild's fortune being sent from a German state through the port of Danzig or Königsberg, I guess, to go to England. How did you manage to control such an epic scale and not make it into a 2,000-page book?
Yeah, I mean, it almost turned into a 2,000-page epic a couple times. It probably could have, but I didn't want to do that much writing. But I think the first book helped because a lot of these characters, again, not to give anything away, but the format is very similar. There are characters who start in physically different parts of France during the French Revolution, and who also are widely different backgrounds, parts of France. Nobility, some are not nobility, some are in the army, some are civilians, lawyers, soldiers, etc. So having the first book and having multiple plot threads and tying them together, I guess gave a little bit of a kind of a dress rehearsal, and a little bit of experience in taking these threads, taking these characters and bringing them together, and ultimately they all kind of interact in one way or another as the book unfolds and as you reach a climax in the story. But I don't think there's one answer of how I did it. I know the part of it is the alternate timeline. So there is an altering timeline to Searchers in Winter, where one character, we pick up his story a year before the rest of the characters are involved in their story. So that was an element of just kind of writing his story, seeing how it plays out, and hoping they interact on a reasonable timeline as you get to the climactic moments of the book. And we had to play around with that a little bit of flashback 1 year earlier, flash forward to the present, flashback 9 months, et cetera, et cetera. So it took a little bit of editorial work with the editors and constructing the story in the timeline. But then in terms of the physical, geographic space, they're all occupying different spaces on the map across Europe. I think really getting the story fleshed out is the most important thing. Getting each character's plot, each character's story, each character's objective, motivation, their obstacle, their antagonists, or their force of antagonism, whatever it is, get the story out, get each character's plot kind of, worked out. And then as you're telling the story and you know where the story is going to go, then you can you maybe write one character, you maybe give them 1 chapter or 2 chapters or 3 chapters, and you write it if you're kind of into a groove there. And then you let the story dictate where the characters are going to end up, how they're going to meet, where they're going to see each other, you know, how their timeline's going to unfold. You really just have to let the story play out. And then once you have all of the main points, all the main plot points, all of the characters' main actions, then you really kind of tinker with, do I go to this character? How long do I stay on for another chapter? Do I flash back in the timeline to a year prior? And that's when you can kind of tinker with the order of how you present it chapter by chapter. But the most important thing is having these characters, having their story, having their plot, which is driven by their need or their objective, their desire, and of course their villain, their antagonism, their antagonist or their force of antagonism. So it really kind of, the easy answer is it works itself out. Once you get the story out, which is the hard part, once you get the plot unfolded, then the characters will find a way into each other's space, you know, geographically, and it kind of it unfolds itself. So that's the easiest answer I can give.
And then
I'm going to ask each of you one more question and then turn it over so that if there's any questions from the viewers, they can ask. Just Owen, quickly. When you and Allie finished Where the Light Falls, it was over. It was done. The characters, some of the key players were still alive, some were not, but it was over. And now, a few years later, we have Searchers in Winter, where some of those key characters are the key players in Searchers in Winter. And at the end, as you said, I'm not going to give it away, some of them are alive. Is there a future role for some of the characters from Searchers in Winter down the road?
Yeah, I mean, that is an exciting question, and one I've wondered about myself. The easy short answer is, I believe so, yes. I think there is a story to tell. I do have an idea for one of the characters. Again, you know, keep saying it, but I don't want to give away who it is, so I won't say who it is. But there is a character who has a story that I've been developing for a little while. I think it's a character that kind of started becoming interesting to me, and I thought that this person has more to kind of flesh out, and there is a story, and it takes place, let's just say, far away from Paris. It doesn't take place in Paris. I don't want to give anything else away, but I don't have a set schedule on how I'm gonna get this story out. We'll see how it unfolds, and like I said, the story kind of speaks to you and unfolds itself, and you just kind of have to like unpack it, or an analogy I use, it's writing a book is kind of like a puzzle where you have the vision, you look at the box, you see the image, you're like, okay, I see what I'm going for. I have an idea of how I want it to end and how I want it to look, but it's not quite as easy as that. It takes a lot of tinkering, and it takes a lot of putting pieces together. This works, this fits, this doesn't fit, and over time, if you're patient enough, the image will start to reveal itself to you. So right now, I'm kind of in the looking at the box, what the puzzle should look like, and I know what I want it to look like, but I haven't finished putting all the pieces together. But I do believe there is more of this story to tell, and hopefully, it comes out as a book. We'll see. I don't want to make any hard announcements or timelines, but I think there is more story to tell. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes.
Well, good. That could be a lot of fun, not for you, but for the readers. And Allison, you did historical women who played a key role. Peggy Shippen, who married Benedict Arnold. Cece, who was the last Empress of Austria-Hungary. Desiree, who was Napoleon's fiancée and Queen of Sweden. This is not a trick question because I know the answer.
Yes.
We thought, what is next for you, Allison Pataki?
Yes. Well, I am so glad you asked, because actually today of all days is a big day, and Owen can relate, and Dad, you can relate. The first time you see a finished book in the flesh, they just arrived in the mail today. And so this is a world at the East Hampton Lit Fest, but answer is that this is what is coming next. It's called The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post. And since we are particularly, I think, an East Hampton or Hamptons centric audience, this book, if you've ever wondered, what does Dina Merrill have to do with Mar-a-Lago, which has to do with Winston Churchill, which has to do with E.F. Hutton, which has to do with Bird's Eye Frozen Foods, and so many other random historical touchstones, including World War II, the Great Depression, the Cold War, the Russian imperial family? The answer is it all has to do with the life of Marjorie Merriweather Post. She was a fascinating leading lady of the 20th century. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her name. She was an iconic trailblazer in philanthropy, society, fashion, business, and culture. But there are not enough books written about her, and there are not enough stories that are inspired by her epic life. And so she lives of Marjorie Merriweather, of Marjorie Post, and how I kind of try to explain it to people who are not familiar with her name, or maybe they're familiar with her name, but they aren't familiar with how juicy and compelling her life story is. I say she's sort of Forrest Gump of the 20th century, but in way better clothes and with way better homes. But her life touched on every moment that we know from the 20th century, and even a little bit before the 20th century. She had a front row seat to history, and she shaped history. And yet her story has not really been told in historical fiction. And so I wrote this novel, The Magnificent Life of Marjorie Post, becoming completely consumed by her life, becoming completely fascinated, pulled into her spell. I loved inhabiting her world. Again, there are some touchstones to the Hamptons, to Dina Merrill, who is a big Hamptons legendary figure, to Mar-a-Lago, and to all these epic moments in history. And so I hope you will read this book or take a look. It's coming in February of 2022, The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post. Her life was fascinating. I truly hope I did it justice in this book, but I absolutely loved learning about her and writing this story, and I'm seeing it for the first time today. So this book will be available in February.
I'm sure you did it. I'm prejudiced, but I'm sure you did it justice, Allison. And
well, thank you for letting me give it.
I haven't read it yet, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
I just want to suggest one thing.
Well, thanks for giving me a plug.
I want to say one thing to the viewers out there. If any of you are in production, Allison's books, Owen's books, they should be a mini series at least, if not an epic movie. And hopefully at some point, Hollywood or Netflix will see the light and understand that these are great. So I wish you great luck, not just with the next book or books, but with what is currently out there that hopefully will be made into an even more available media. So now, Allison, we'll turn it over to you and see if there's any questions from viewers, or if we should end this now.
Absolutely. So we do have one question in our chat box here. If you do have any other questions, feel free to write it in the Q&A and I'll read them off. We are getting towards the end here, but we do have a question from Sheila, who asks, do you see any similarities between the current state of politics to what occurred in Europe during the 19th century? Does history repeat itself?
Who wants to touch that one?
I guess I'll take that one, or at least the first part. Yes, I do. And that's a very kind of broad topic, and that's a broad answer. I will say this, because I don't really want to get caught up into anything too specific, because it's hard to judge. It's hard to put the context of the early 1800s or the late 1700s and compare it directly one-to-one with today. But I will say that I think, as I was studying the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon and the Napoleonic Empire and the wars, I did notice one thing, and that is, to me, there's a very strong bond and natural similarity and spirit of, let's say, socio-political philosophy between historically and today, but historically especially between France and the United States. And I think what I mean by that is the American Revolution, we got rid of a king and created a republic. What did the French Revolution, with very different results and very different means and in very different contexts, what did they try to do? Get rid of a king and create a republic. It didn't work out too well. It obviously turned into a reign of terror, and Napoleon came after that. But I do think there are parallels between the French Republic and the American Republic, and just like in the American Revolution and having this kind of dark mirror, as you put it, Ali, into the French Revolution, I do think that there are a few things that we can take away from each other and kind of learn from each other. And I mean that historically, and that is France has, since the beginning, and for a multitude of reasons, always struggled with their republic. Like we saw, the republic devolved into anarchy, turned into an empire, went back to a kingdom under the Bourbons. The empire came back, a republic came back, the Les Miserables time period, a second empire, then a third republic. Then you had World War I, you had the Franco-Prussian War with the German occupation, you had the Nazis and World War II, obviously. So what I mean when I say that America and France have a similar kind of socio-political spirit is that they're constantly struggling with their republic. Their republic had a very nasty, horrifying in many ways, birth. Ours didn't have such a challenging start. Our democratic institutions, our republic, had a lot smoother, let's say, of a birth because we were 3,000 miles away from the king, from the British, from the redcoats who had to come across. So our revolution was more of a colonial revolt than a full-on revolution. So seeing the French Republic's struggles and their devolution into empire and Napoleon crowning himself emperor is, to me, it kind of shows that there are always going to be struggles. There are always going to be temptations to abandon the democratic principles or to see a military dictatorship take the place of democratic rule, or there's going to be these horrific political moments of infighting, and there's this divisiveness, and there's this just fundamentally different worldviews. And that's, I don't mean to say that's okay, but in a sense, that shouldn't be a reason to abandon the principles that work. The Republican principles that the American Revolution kind of gave us, the founders, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. The French, again, did it in a different way, but they tried to create a republic. And it's kind of nasty work sometimes. Sometimes it's divisive, sometimes it's ugly, but it's better than a dictatorship. It's better than an empire. It's better than blood in the streets and violent revolutions that just kill anyone that disagrees with them. So our political upheavals, our divisiveness, the divisions, the rancor in our politics, that's nothing totally new. That is not new to American history. We've had our own civil wars. We've had our own divisions. And you study French history and you see the same thing. So we shouldn't be totally despaired. Every generation has a moment where you think, God, we're about to lose it. Is this the end of the American Republican democratic experiment? This, that, the other thing. There's always problems, and you study history and the countries continue on. So my study of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era shows you that history is messy, history is sometimes violent, but it's at very least contentious and divisive. So we shouldn't give up hope and think that things are so bad, COVID is so bad, our divisions are insurmountable. They're not. It's just an ugly chapter. It's a challenging chapter, but it's not the end. And we've seen that historically, and countries move on. So that's my kind of long-winded sermon.
I would just add that I think something it made me sort of stop in my tracks and note was that it is an academic thing, and citizens are participants. And just so that, as you see with how it goes in the French Revolution versus how it went in our revolution, but also how it continues to this day, is that it's never something to be taken for granted, that it's really in the hands of the citizens, and so we all need to participate. I see we're running out of time, but I just see two more questions I would love to answer very quickly, if that's okay. And obviously, if people need to go, they can go. But this one's very interesting, from Louisa, saying, what were the circumstances that led to the Swedes asking for a French man to become their king? And why I want to answer that is because it's so interesting, because it shows just the rise and fall of Napoleon. Napoleon was putting kings and queens on the thrones of so much of Europe. And so he had this confederation that extended across Europe all the way to Russia, at the nexus, at the height of power. And so many of these countries wanted to align with Napoleon's regime. And so they asked Napoleon and Napoleonic France to give them a king. They came to the end of the line in terms of their hereditary ruling family. They saw that there was not going to be an heir to the current king. And so they really came to Paris looking for somebody who Napoleon could support. And the reason why they asked for Bernadotte was in large part because of how close Bernadotte and Desiree were to the Bonapartes. Because as my father mentioned earlier, Desiree's sister was married to Napoleon's brother. So they were part of the Bonaparte family. Bernadotte was a Marshal of France. He was considered at that point one of Napoleon's closest generals and allies and friends. And so they asked for Napoleon to pick a king, and he picked. And so I think that's just really important so that you understand some of the dynamics of the relationship. And if you want to know more about it, Louisa, it is in the Queen's Fortune. So you can read all about how exactly those circumstances came about and why Desiree and Bernadotte became King and Queen of Sweden. But it was fascinating. And I agree with you that it's not immediately logical or you know, the first thing you would think of is why would the Swedes come to Paris and ask for a French man to become their king? So you should read more about it in the Queen's Fortune. And then the other question was, what do you think the historical outcome would have been had Josephine not so rudely preempted Desiree's romance with Napoleon? I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. And I've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I can't say with entire certainty, obviously, how history would have played out, but I don't think you can overestimate the significance of the fact that Napoleon and Josephine could not conceive of a son, because Napoleon was obsessed with his empire and his legacy. And he saw the chaos that had preempted his administration. And he saw the way people could exploit chaos for their own power. And he knew the only way to avoid chaos for his regime was to have a clear line of succession. And what is the most important thing for the clear line of succession was for him to have an heir and for him to have a son. And so the fact that he could not have a son with Josephine, you can see it when you're studying him and you're studying his administration and you're studying some of the decisions he makes in terms of going to war or, you know, within the power dynamics of the Tuileries administration. The fact that he didn't have a son, I think, drove him crazy. And so had he married Desiree, had they had a son, had they had many sons, I think you could make the case that history could have played out very differently. And I think he could have maybe made very different political decisions based on the fact that he would have felt that his reign and his legacy was more secure had he had, you know, a family and a son to pass his throne on to. Because that was the question, really, was securing his reign and securing his administration. So I hope those answered those two questions.
Yes, thank you so much for being here with us, the Pataki family. On behalf of the East Hampton Library, thank you to all our attendees. It was really great. And if you haven't read the book, go check it out, as well as Allison's new book coming out next year or early next year. Otherwise, have a great night, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you all.